Hashtag June 6th, 1944. The day U.S. generals put everything on Omaha and didn't blink. Before dawn, the sea looked like iron and moved like a thing with lungs. The flagship's wake stitched a white seam through the swells, and on the bridge of Augusta, Omar Bradley read weather notes that were really judgments. Wind force, ceiling, swell height, each a way of saying, "You've asked men to wager their lives against physics dash." He didn't blink. The timetable held. The ships kept station, black silhouettes on darker water. The talkers whispered bearings. The signal lamps threw small, urgent galaxies across the chop. "Last chance to turn back," someone said in a voice that wanted to be joking. The first U.S. Army commander shook his head. There was no last chance now. Only first consequences dash. He thought of Kasserine and of the boys who had paid for other people's learning. He thought of what a day like this would feel like if you were 19 and seasick and told to climb down a cargo net into a boat that slammed like a door on each wave. He thought of what the maps could not show, that men arrive with the human jitter still in them and must assemble themselves into courage while under fire dash. At 5:30, the horizon fainted from black to bruised violet. The barrage began, cruiser guns thumping the bluffs, destroyers flinging angry commas toward nests of concrete, bombers droning inland. It felt like an answer to the months of whispering and masking and knitting together fleets and air groups and armies. It was also, unbeknownst to those watching from the flagship, a poor precursor for what came next. Too short, too far inland. The casemates and trenches on the bluffs kept their teeth. Hour 4. Omaha, 6:30. On the troop decks of the transports, young men tightened chin straps they'd already tightened 4 times. A private from Virginia named Malloy tried to swallow and found he'd misplaced the trick. Next to him, a medic, Ray, touched his pocket for the 100th time to feel the Surette ampoules and bandages, small charms against large facts. They had trained to land on Easy Red and Dog Green and Fox Green, but training dies in first contact and is reborn as habits dash. They would live or die by what had become habit. The boats dropped, engines snarling against the sea in their faces, and the men bunched under the spray like question marks. Somewhere behind them, an officer retched quietly and then stood up as if to apologize to the god of composure. 5 minutes, shouted a coxswain, which meant 3 or 8 or 2, depending on what the ocean felt like. Ahead, there was a low smear, the line where France began, where years of war would try to end. On Augusta, Bradley watched through binoculars that never seemed close enough. The green arcs of rockets, the white flares of fire missions called in by spotters who were somewhere out there, prone and unseen. The boats making their slanted runs. The plumes of mortars that looked almost delicate from 6 miles away and killed with brutal precision down on the sand. One set of reports arrived with the first light. Utah had mislanded by a mile and lucked into something better. "We'll start the war from here," someone over there had said, and Bradley could almost smile at the bluntness. Airborne units were scattered like coins thrown from a handful, but many landed near the places they needed to be or made those places matter by being there. Omaha stayed silent a little too long and then started speaking all at once. The first drafts of the day's history were written in a code of clipped phrases. Strong resistance. DD tanks foundered. Obstacles heavy. Casualties high. Pins at the shingle. He didn't blink. He waited for the next increment of the world. On the beach, the water was a feverish gray and the air an argument. Screams, orders, that high mosquito whine of incoming fire, the indignant honk of a mortar, the snarling rip of a machine gun. The tide grabbed boots and rifles and men as if it had been told to do it. The duplex drive tanks had been meant to lead the dance, waddling ashore with their strange canvas skirts up like tutus. Far offshore, many of them went down instead, burying hope and crews in cold water. Those that made it, beaching like green whales, were precious and too few. The first waves met the obstacle belt, hedgehog stakes mines, and slalomed as best they could in that killing ground. When the ramps banged down, the water in front of them spurted like a pan on a stove. Men splashed into waist-high sea that became chest-high and then neck-high because fear makes you shorter. A boy named Malloy saw the man in front of him drop as if yanked backward by an invisible chain and stepped over him because the human brain is a poor camera and only takes what it can. They reached the shingle, that ridge of cobble and sand where the sea threw its stones, and flattened under it because the world insisted. The beach was shaped like the fraction bar in a terrible equation. Above it, the bluffs were dotted with gun ports that had not been crushed by the pre-landing fires. The German 352 Indie Infantry Division S shooters knew their sight lines. It felt to the Americans like trying to stand up while a hand pressed the back of your neck. A boat loaded with 105 howitzers, the Dukus that had been meant to bring artillery ashore, wallowed and rolled, and one after another slid backward into a green that had no patience. A chaplain crawled with his cross. A radio man babbied his set against the surf. A sergeant discovered his voice and could not stop it from cracking into teenage, even as he told men twice his size to move. A man in a ranger tab on his sleeve belly crawled up to a line of blown wire and said, matter-of-factly, "We were told to go up," as if the order had been to pick up milk on the way home. At Point du Hoc, west of the beach, rangers scaled cliffs studded with concrete and bad intentions, grapnels biting into turf and roots, rockets trailing ropes up into a morning that pretended to be kind. The men climbed through spitting fire and falling rock. When they found the gun positions empty, real field pieces hidden back in an orchard like contraband, they pushed inland and put thermite into the sights and breeches of guns intended to kill their friends on the beach. A destroyer, Satterley, stitched the cliff edge with fire to keep the counterattackers off the lip. You couldn't see that interplay from the flagship except on a plot board, but the day held together because dozens of such interlocks happened without waiting for permission. By 7:30, the reports that made it off the beach sounded like the diary of a disaster. Units intermingled. Heavy casualties. Movement pinned. Tanks? Few. Engineers taking losses at obstacles. Bradley felt the room tilt, a sensation not from the sea, and steadied it with discipline. V Corps Commander, Leonard Jarrow, was somewhere closer to the blunt end of the spear, his staff hunched over maps already obsolete. Clarence Hubner of the 1st Infantry Division kept sending fragments that had to be assembled like a broken mirror. Charles Gerhardt of the 29th would come ashore later into the aftermath. On the beach, Brigadier General Norman Dutchkota, 29th's assistant division commander, crawled through shell slaps and flying debris, tasting salt and cordite, and did the thing that would get turned into legend later. Told men to get up, move forward, stop waiting for permission that could not arrive. Later, they would condense what he shouted to the Rangers into a motto. That's what history does to moments that begin as chaos. It makes them sentence long. But the question on the flagship was not a motto. It was bleak. Do we keep sending men ashore into this? There were plans, and then there are commitments. The plans included contingencies for diverting follow-on waves from Omaha, Utah, if catastrophe set in. The destroyer skippers on Force O had begun to disobey their safe distance lines, edging in toward the shore until their keels scraped near rocks, because in that narrow geometry the only mercy available was accuracy. McCook, Doyle, Frankfurt, Carmick, Greyhounds who closed to within a few thousand yards and fired at German embrasures as if it were a range. Shells going in through openings that had looked like punctuation marks from offshore. At 8:45, another packet of messages. The surface of each was calm. Underneath, panic swam. A regimental colonel begged for smoke, for guns, for God. An engineer captain said, in the way men say such things when they are exhausted and still working, that they could get gaps through the belt if we can work 5 more minutes without being killed. If we can work 5 more minutes, Bradley handed the note back. He did not blink. He had trained himself to play through the sequence. What happens if we stop dash? The beach collapses into a killing zone littered with dead and dying. The boats reverse under fire. The enemy reinforces the bluffs and turns the shingle into a moat. The day bleeds out. What happens if we continue dash? More men into more fire, but also more mass that could create the small, critical irregularities through which victory trickles. He'd once written that command was the art of taking more responsibility than you have time. It turned out to be the art of staring at two bad doors and choosing the one that led to work. Continue landing at Omaha, he told his staff. Commit the reserves. Someone said the weather was worse than expected. The enemy is as expected, he replied, not unkindly. He sent a message that did not leave room for romantic misreading. The follow-on waves would go in. Destroyers were to keep closing. Naval gunfire, to answer every call that could be answered. Engineers, to blow paths. Tanks, to be landed as they could be, even without the silly canvas skirts. If you were lying under the shingle in front of Easy Red, you didn't feel the general's decision. You felt the extra weight of the tide on your boots and a machine gun that seemed to be in the specific business of drilling the sand around your head. But changes propagate. The destroyer's shells began to smash the flanking casemates. The engineers crawled to obstacles with their satchel charges, like men bringing birthday cakes with the candles already lit. A lieutenant with a voice like a hammer assembled a squad from 3 companies and said, "We're a unit now. Up. Hey, Bangalore." Went in under wire, and the explosion broke the quiet of refusal. Through the breach, they went one by one, because nobody goes as an army through a hole you can cover with a poncho. Up the draws, the dirt tracks that cut the bluffs like poorly healed scars. Men climbed, slipping and swearing and praying and shooting back when they could see what to shoot. A corporal named Ruiz found himself leader of men because the men with bars were down. He moved because there was nothing else to do that would change the future. Coda, covered in sand and other people's courage, found an engineer team near Exit D3 and knelt to make his world this big. Where is the wire? Where is the trench? Where will the next shell fall if the last one fell there? He put his hand on a man's shoulder and made him a human being instead of target by telling him a specific job. Cut here. Generalship at that range is not chess. It's carpentry with explosives. The 1 SD Division, companies on Easy Red, began to edge up the slope under their own smoke. On Dog Green, remnants of the 1/16th men from Bedford, Virginia, whose town would wake to a kind of arithmetic nobody wanted, found a place where the bluff was looser, the path less obvious to a gunner's eye, and went on hands and knees, weapons slung, knives out for wire. By 10 o'clock, Augusta had received everything from rumors of evacuation to reports of small penetrations. Bradley took them down, refused to be their echo. He had an accidental ally he could not see, the destroyer captains, who began making calling cards of their own. One boat edged so close that the gunners depressed their barrels beyond what the manual allowed. They hit gun ports like hitting knotholes with thrown rocks. Onshore spotters, some rangers, some forward observers from the 1st Division who had crawled to where they could see, called corrections in a voice you use at the dinner table because you think that will keep the gods from hearing. Left 1, drop 1. Shells obliged. A cliff faced the afternoon with wounds. Someone hurried a note into Bradley's hand. Reports of success near the E1 draw. It was not fanfare. It was a sentence. But sentences made from that part of the beach are rare. He made them precious by believing them just enough to press them with his will. On the Sam Malloy, who until 2 hours ago had never heard his own voice as anything but shyness, found himself shouting men forward because his voice obeyed physics even if his nerve did not. Ray the medic used the side of the sea wall as a table and his back as faith. He could not save everyone. He saved who he could because the premise of his trade is that absolutes destroy the soul. They crawled, they ran, they fell, they got up, they pretended they were characters in someone else's brave story. They admitted they were terrified. They did the next sensible thing. A machine gun position that had seemed like a factory of death became 3 shapes on a bluff, then 2, then 1, and then a crater with nobody in it who wanted anything anymore. At the end, and E3 draws, engineers, blew openings through the seawall, smoke grenades rolled, and small wedges of men slipped into the cuts in the land. The bigger units did not go up together. This was a day won by platoons and ad hoc gangs, not by geometries pre-approved in a tent. Back on the flagship, a junior staff officer, 26 and too old by noon, floated the idea again of diverting follow-on waves from Omaha, Utah. Bradley did the quiet thing that reads as courage only in memoirs. He said no. He did not raise his voice. He simply refused to turn suffering into a loop. Reinforce success, here, he said, stabbing with a pencil at a map that was increasingly a work of imagination. Commit, the 18th Regiment. As planned, came Jarrow's voice up the wire. Hubner's message was a growl through static. We are getting through. Destroyers came closer still. A sailor on McCook later said they could see the color of the sand behind the gun ports they were firing into. The Navy's doctrine loosened its collar and did what was needed. By 11:30, men who had not dared lift their heads above the shingle at 7 o'clock were peering over it because the fire that had been strafing every blink now hesitated. You can feel an enemy's attention shift. You could be wrong. They were right just enough times to make a difference. Behind the bluffs inland, hedgerows boxed the fields into green rooms, and the war changed keys. But we hadn't got there yet. We were still in the throat of the day. On Fox Green, parts of the 16th Infantry found that the German positions didn't have endless magazines. On Easy Red, a lieutenant found himself dropping mortar shells into a tube he'd never touched before because the mortar team hadn't made it. He had seen it done. That turned out to be enough. Near Collaville, a company commander took inventory. 36 men who claimed him because the last man they'd claimed was down. He nodded as if to say, I'll do dash. Soldiers recognized that nod. They will go far for it. At noon, word carried like a rumor that can be believed. Exit secured. Not all, not cleanly, but some. There is a geometry to beach assaults. Once a draw is held by the attacker, the defender's ability to rake the beach collapses in sectors. The tide, enemy all morning, began to take down obstacles that had threatened the follow-on waves. Engineers, working like accountants of explosives, marked safe lanes with tape and panels because order is a kindness we owe the living. The 5th Ranger Battalion, having diverted from Point du Hoc to Omaha because the Cliff Assault had its own story to write, moved through a breach so abruptly that a German machine gunner ran out of belt and nerve at the same time. Someone later remembered Coda telling them to go first. Someone else remembered nobody telling them anything at all, only movement like a decision made with legs. Bradley got the report that no commander wants to believe prematurely. We are off the beach at several points. He had learned not to lean on optimism like a cane. He put it in his pocket like a coin and kept working. In the floating hospital ships and on the sand through the afternoon, the wounded were sorted by men who had lost their contempt for Triave sometime in Tunisia. Ray the medic, hands sticky with other people's futures, looked up at the bluff and decided, without the permission of any philosophy, that the thing happening up there might be worth what had happened here. When he got a breather, he took out the scrap of paper on which he had written the name of the beach and crossed the name out because he'd learned that precision is a luxury and he couldn't afford it. He would remember the faces instead. At 1400 hours, the beach no longer looked like the world's cruelest reservoir. It looked like a yard where a hard job was still being done. Traffic lines began to appear, the primal comfort of a line. Bulldozers nosed their way into usefulness. Causeways, improvised themselves out of trucks and planks. Shore parties waved flags like symphony conductors who had decided to let the brass have it for a while. On the bluffs, a German lieutenant pointed at two Americans trying to move across a patch of open ground as if he were patient with them. A round from a destroyer cut the gesture in half. The survivors of the morning's shock and clogged fear pushed through hedgerows and into the second act of the war. It is easy to write that Omaha was secure by afternoon. It was not. It had tilted. The line between catastrophe and foothold is thin, ragged, and trodden by men who do not get to see their steps as part of a pattern. The 352 ND was broken in places and not in others. Pockets of resistance continued to eat minutes and lives until evening. The beach remained a place of transit, a place for the dead, and a place to be gotten off as soon as you could let your life become a set piece for someone else's narration. Bradley looked up from his map to the real horizon and let himself, for once, feel the boat under him. The radio talk did not slow, but its timbre had changed. He sent a message to Jero that was so understated it might have been a weather report. Prospects improving in several sectors. He could have said, "They're doing it." He did not. He saved that for the quiet. Across the beach in the late light, you could see caves of shadow where morning had lived. Now they were just shadows. A group of sailors waded ashore carrying crates above their heads the way men carry brides. And one of them laughed, as if he had remembered that laughter was allowed. Coda, powder-streaked and hoarse, paused to drink water that tasted of tin and triumph. He was not a man for speeches. He told a young officer from the 29th, "Now you own something. Hold it." The boy nodded. Ownership was a concept he felt roughly. A little ground, a thin line, some men with him who would not leave until he did. A company from the 1st Division dug in behind a hedgerow that someone's grandfather had laid before America existed. They stacked their ammo like small promises. The captain wrote a note to Hubner that could have been carved into the hedge. "We're through in strength here." He believed it because the air in his lungs did not taste of salt anymore. On the beach, Ray the medic found Malloy finally sitting, knees muddy, hands useless in his lap. "You alive?" Ray asked. Malloy blinked and looked at his hands as if he had borrowed them. "Think so." "Then get up," Ray said, not unkindly. "They're going that way." They went that way. Evening lowered itself gently for a day that had not been gentle. Bradley's staff slumped into the fatigue that follows adrenaline the way a tide follows the moon. The admiral in charge of the naval gunfire walked in, hat under his arm, and said, "My destroyer skippers will have to seek absolution for disobeying their safety lines." Bradley said, "I'll write the letter." It wasn't a joke. It was a vow to remember what kind of recklessness had been required. Aboard other ships, men who had done math all morning and prayers all afternoon put away their pencils and rosaries and stared at their hands. Some of them wrote home preemptively, sentences full of stoicism they didn't feel. "We're fine," they lied, and it was a fine lie. The truth would need time. Back ashore, under the first evening racks of B-26s still making runs inland, a battalion commander counted by names and got smaller answers than he'd had at breakfast. He did not blink either. He said the names again as if they were a multiplication table that would turn him back into someone else. Then he sent a runner with a simple order, "Keep widening." In the German, post now cut off by the afternoon's nibble, a Feldwebel who'd spent all morning feeling invulnerable discovered that doctrine has its own kind of panic when the enemy appears behind the line that had been called impenetrable in lectures. He kicked a door in, found his breath laying wrong in his chest, and understood that the fight had left the geometry of the beach and entered the Messier arithmetic of fields and lanes where the American habit of improvisation would eat at his sense of order. Much later, well after midnight, a cook on a landing craft boiled coffee that tasted like wire and gave it to men who might have wept if they'd had salt left for it. A destroyer skipper on, Doyle, walked the length of his bridge, and paused at the spot where a splinter had missed him by the width of a chair. He tapped the deck with his knuckles, a thank you to something he didn't care to name. On the flagship, Bradley finally let himself exhale all the way. He didn't write anything in a personal diary. He had not come to France to compose sentences. He had come to continue dash. If you force this day into a single idea, if you insist on the cruelty of summation, here it is. They kept sending men into the worst place on earth because the only other choice was to let the worst place on earth define the war. Put everything on Omaha, the title will say, and didn't blink. That makes it sound like one steady gaze from one man on one ship. It wasn't. It was 10,000 micro-decisions. A general saying no to an elegant failure. A captain closing the range because accuracy is mercy. An engineer setting a charge with fingers that couldn't stop shaking. A medic choosing who to save. A brigadier making strangers into a unit with 3 rough words. A private standing up in the exact second when not standing meant more men dying. You can count that as generalship if you like. The men who carried it out will tell you it felt like finding the next foothold with your boot while your other foot hung over nothing. At Omaha, the United States military found the nasty, practical meaning of courage. Not fearlessness, not grandiloquence, not the clean line of a plan that works. Courage is continuity. Courage is refusal to let the moment reroute the campaign. Courage as the grim professional insistence that the only way out was through and up into hedgerows, farm lanes, villages, toward a line on a map that some staff officer with his own private Kasserine had drawn because somebody had to say what forward meant. By the time dawn came again, the beach had become a place you could walk without ducking every third step. The sea still filed its complaint, spraying the obstacles the tide had spared. The bluffs were behind the men who had been pinned under them. And in 100 homes in America, telephones would ring in some distant tomorrow. The generals would carry their decisions a long time. The destroyer captains their daring, the ranger sergeants their dead, the medics their triage, the privates their single, unglamorous act of getting up when the calculus said not to. June 6th, 1944. Omaha. The day a plan failed its first drafts, and a million small, stubborn acts wrote a new one. The day U.S. generals put everything on that strip of sand and, alongside sailors and sergeants and boys who had never been to France before they tasted it, didn't blink.